Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Mental health workers. What's the scariest mental health condition that you've come across? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
I used to work as a clinician in a jail. I conducted a suicide risk assessment on a young man who faced charges of strangling his mother. The first day I met him, I spoke to him through his cell door. He reported command hallucinations that told him to hurt people. The next day I assessed him right outside his cell as he was coming back from court. There was a deputy present. He seemed very with it and optimistic. He knew what happened at court and told me his aunt was going to post his bond. Halfway through the conversation, I saw something shift in his demeanor. I didn't realize this, but looking back at camera footage, I unconsciously took a step backward. He suddenly lunged for my neck, and I ran down the hallway. He ran in the opposite direction and was tackled by the deputy. His eyes still haunt me. Psych RN. While it may not be the most frightening condition, I believe that people often underestimate the impact of OCD. Severe OCD can be totally debilitating to the point where it can cost a person their job, their family, and their life. I've taken care of patients who present to the hospital with suicidal ideation because their OCD is so exhausting that they basically see no other way to get relief except to end their lives. People who are really particular about something and say, "Oh, that's just my OCD kicking in," have no clue. I was in the field over 30 years ago. I think the scariest thing I saw was actually what broke me from the job. I was in CPS, and it was a case of a person who kept adopting and abusing, and the kids were abusing each other. Almost every person that worked on that case no longer works in the field anymore because it was just too much on the soul. I bake cookies now. 10-year-old boy presenting very typical to above average in intelligence, looks, personality, etc. You wouldn't have given him a second look or thought anything was wrong with him if you saw him in your child's school. He was placed at our residential treatment center after he put his infant half-sister in a chest freezer and refused to tell the parents where she was. Now, thankfully, she was found quickly and was okay. But the whole time they were searching the house and yelling and begging him to tell them, he calmly sat there and refused with a small smile on his face. No history of abuse, neglect, head injury, birth injury, etc. When asked why, he said because he could. He enjoyed watching the terror on his dad's and stepmother's faces. He also abused his younger roommate while at our facility, terrorized the roommate, saying he would kill their family if they told anyone. After that, his parents were given a choice by a judge: registered as offender or DNA on the list. I believe they chose that his DNA be put into a database. I watched the news for his name. It was definitely a case of someone who was born that way, a natural born sociopath. Scariest child I ever dealt with in 20 years. I had some very angry children with behavioral issues, children who disassociated, and children who attacked others on a regular basis. But they all had a reason, so to speak. There was a history of intense abuse or neglect, or organic brain injury, or RAD or autism. But this kid, he'd charm the world and be a serial killer behind the scenes. Disregarding child abuse, a specific type of auditory hallucinations may occur. Thinking of voices coming in at levels. If you heard someone say something on a TV show, you'd be able to completely ignore it and think of it as nothing real. Then you have someone speaking directly to you, which you'd take more seriously. Then you have thoughts you may have, and you can think about them like, "I should do laundry." You can consider that and choose not to do it, even if it's clearly your own thought. Then there's the absolutely instinctive things coming in behind your ability to think about them, like wincing or just walking. You just do it. I worked with people on all those levels, For one person, though, the voices were at the lowest level. When they advised her to cut herself, she simply followed their instructions. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't tell anyone it was about to happen. There was no conscious choice. The amount of medication needed to make it stop basically made her catatonic. So that sucked. OCD. We had a 20-year-old guy who was so tortured by his own brain that no medication could help. He would get stuck in these endless loops of asking if everything would be okay, but never being able to accept the answer. And if you tried to answer with anything other than yes, it's going to be okay, he'd yell over you, repeating the question with increasing panic until you gave the correct answer. And then the process would start all over again. It absolutely tore his family apart, and then came the intrusive thoughts about his younger sister. The poor guy hated himself for making his family suffer so much, and the thoughts he was having about his sister that he tried to end his life 3 times, once before admission and twice in the short periods between discharge and readmission. On the 4th attempt, he succeeded at ending his life, and I've never seen a family so torn between grief, guilt, and relief. One of my clients went from being okay one day to hearing stuff that wasn't there, being afraid all the time, slowly going nonverbal, having stupors and strange mannerisms he hadn't displayed before, and being unable to do simple tasks like drinking from a cup the next day. He slowly grew more nonverbal, anxious, confused, and stiffened up. At one point, he would just walk in circles in his room, call you weird names, and not sleep for days on end. We have fought to get this kid professional help for 2 weeks, and then he finally got admitted to the hospital. It turned out he had a catatonia, which is a rather complex neuropsychiatric syndrome that disrupts how your brain works. He needed months of different therapies before he got better. Psychologist therapist here. Anorexia nervosa is one of the most scary mental health conditions I've worked with, the deadliest of all too. There are a lot of people now struggling with EDs, and it's horrific and very hard for every single person living through this. However, the classic purely restrictive anorexia nervosa can be close to psychosis. They starve themselves to death, and you can't do anything about it. They don't see themselves as sick. They don't see their body as it is. Sometimes it seems unstoppable. I wonder how people with anorexia can survive without food, over-exercise, and under-eat for extended periods. Most people, thankfully, would pass out and just struggle too much to keep this thing going. It's scary how their body can resist this torture until it can't anymore. They will die from not eating, absolutely unable to force themselves to eat, and feeling like they absolutely want to live, but can't eat. Being on an adolescent psych floor is heartbreaking more than scary, but I wanted to post about it because it was really jarring to see how children's mental illnesses present. I was around kids from 10 to 16 years old, and they almost all had some form of disordered eating because of all the ways they didn't have control in their lives. They could control eating. We had one preteen who had been severely SA'd. They wouldn't eat or speak to anyone for months, so they had to have an NG tube put in, a tube that is inserted into the nostril down into the stomach so they could be tube fed. Another very sweet and polite kid that was totally pleasant on the unit had horrible command hallucinations, constantly telling them to kill their family. Mental illness destroying lives is never easy to watch, though watching children struggle is another level of heartache. Young kids are the hardest for me. A 5-year-old plotted, concealed, and then held a paraprofessional who is in a wheelchair, easier to overpower, from behind with a knife to her neck because he claimed he was being told to do so by his brain. He was exceedingly strong for his age, weighed almost as much as she did, and was exceedingly determined. Had they not been in earshot of others, it may have gone much worse. Thinking about kids who are downright dangerous to adults is really hard. We know his family of origin. His behavior wasn't directly caused by his external experiences. It stemmed from his own mind, and he had to cope with that reality through his life. It may be not as terrifying as being overpowered by an adult, but it's deeply, overwhelmingly sad in other ways. I didn't specifically work in mental health, but I did work in a long-term care facility, nursing home. I worked on the secure unit, mostly seniors with varying stages of dementia. The average age was probably early to mid-80s. A resident with Korsakoff syndrome moved in. It is a type of dementia caused by alcoholism. It was pretty advanced, like she could not tell you where she was or what day it was. She was 34. Dementia is an utterly horrible disease, but to know that hers was preventable and brought on so young because of her actions, although I know alcoholism is a terrible disease as well, was really difficult to see. And then to know that the system couldn't support her anywhere else, and so she has to live her young life in a nursing home is really sad. I was a psych nurse for a year, and I could name so many. I'd say synthetic marijuana-induced psychosis was frightening because it could happen to anyone. I'd see lifetime smokers, med students, gangsters, mothers, you name it. Completely normal people who became extremely psychotic for weeks or months. Researchers found one med student running around campus naked, yelling that his roommate was about to kill him. These people were essentially ruining their lives until someone was able to force them to be admitted. One of the scariest parts is that a lot of them didn't remember anything from that time, maybe for the best. I honestly compare it to being possessed. The person you actually are is locked away somewhere else in the brain, while this parasitic demon is running on pure visceral emotion. The scariest condition aside from dementia would be schizophrenia. I can't imagine what it's like to have that diagnosis. I know there are degrees of severity, but to see things that aren't there, they're mostly frightening in nature. To not know whether you can trust your family or doctors there to help you because of the fear and paranoia you constantly live with must be hell. And for any mental illness, there is no cure-all, and it takes years to find a balance of meds that work well if you're lucky. Some people who find medication for schizophrenia find themselves feeling like a zombie on meds, and the other option is to feel paranoid, afraid, or catatonic. I've personally seen some truly awful trauma in children though, from the being placed in the ER for stabilization and placement. I've seen a hypersexual and violent 5-year-old girl who only ended up that way due to trauma, and it was awful to see and to manage. There was also one child I cared for briefly that had a history of violence toward family members and animals and had zero remorse or emotion regarding it. I got serious vibes that he would hurt or kill someone in the future. Psych can be so sad to specialize in. I worked on a catch-all med-surg floor. We were the de facto medical psych floor. Essentially, patients who were too medically unwell to be in psych, we would treat and then move them to psych. I'll never forget this patient. They had actually been a worker on the floor prior to me starting, so I often ended up as their nurse because I was one of the few people who hadn't known them prior to their breakdown. They had been horribly abused by their father and had kept it together enough until they had their own kids, where they had a total breakdown, which led to a run of constant suicide attempts. They would be found in a suicide attempt, usually by their poor partner, and then placed on a psych hold. The attempt I remember most was after they had been discharged after slitting their wrists, and their partner caught them overdosing on pills. They immediately returned to the hospital, where they remained in a catatonic state. Suicide attempts always have a 1-to-1, basically. Someone is just sitting in their room 24/7 watching them. They had been doing better, so they weren't in restraints. Right at the end of my shift, the patient made a run for it, bolted upright, and was heading for the floor doors. The poor CNA was dragging behind them, and even when I grabbed onto them, they just kept pushing forward. I was easily 80 pounds heavier, and this tiny waif of a thing was moving steadily towards the door. It took 4 fully grown men to get them back in bed and restraints, and that was with medical interventions, P52. All the while, the charge nurse and other colleagues who knew the patient were crying and pleading with the patient to stop, while the patient just had these blank, empty eyes. Nothing there but the desire to escape and hurt themselves. I had to call the partner to let them know what happened, and that poor partner just sounded so defeated, so exhausted, raising the kids and trying to take care of their parents, all in a system that cannot or will not care for them. There were many mornings I cried after night shifts on the train home. This was one of the times I sobbed. My own grandmother had killed herself drowning, as had her sister hanging, and my cousin had attempted many suicide attempts, but is still here. What happened to them? What happened to this patient? I can't think about it too much. To be honest, bulimia. I worked in a hospital for people with severe eating disorders for years. The desperation of these people, they would do anything to not gain weight, including vomiting in their clothes and puzzle boxes on the unit. They would hide it in shampoo bottles. They would take massive amounts of laxatives, 100 per day sometimes. They put things in their rectum before they got weighed in the morning so they weigh more. They ruin their teeth, they ruin their stomachs. They get such electrolyte imbalances that they literally have heart attacks. They end up with colostomy bags from the abuse on their GI tract. They legit die. It's a disgusting disease. The situation arises when a police officer suffers from antisocial personality disorder. You can't fire him because the police unions support him. He beats his wife and kids, but there's nothing you can do about it because everyone at the police department is his friend. His wife and kids can't hide at the shelter either because he knows its location. You can't take away his gun either because it's for official law enforcement use. A lot of times, he ends up killing his wife. You saw all the signs, but you couldn't do anything. Dissociative identity disorder. The patient was recovered by the FBI at 4 years old after being repeatedly assaulted and filmed from infancy. She was adopted by a very nice older couple who did their best. She had 5 kids in her teens and 20s. The last 3 were with a stable and really good man. All of her children went into the foster system when he died. She died years later from addiction. All of her children are struggling with the fallout. She did her best and loved her kids, but nothing could heal her or stop her from splitting. Borderline personality disorder can be frightening because it looks like so many things if you don't take a step back. It's a high suicide risk, but patients don't trust authority figures like doctors to properly treat them. One patient was, by most metrics, undiagnosed with borderline. They frequently lied to providers, staff, and police, were highly combative, and relied on underage family to manage their life. Depending on the month, there was a new disorder they were 100% convinced they had. One was schizophrenia, around when TikTokers would film their altars for clicks, which they used to explain the violent outburst against family and strangers. The only real treatment for borderline is psychotherapy, which many of them are immediately opposed to. If they do accept it, the lies can build up until therapists discharge them since they can't treat them. A lot of people with borderline fall through the cracks, wind up in jail or on drugs, and cut their families down in the middle between. We have to help, but they won't accept it. It is, by and large, one of the most exhausting diagnoses for families and caregivers. I'm not sure what category this falls under, but it comes from my grandmother. She was a custodian in a place called Bayview Mental Hospital before working for Sharp. It was a place in the 70s where people of all ages would just get dropped off by families to become wards of the state. There was a boy, she said, who couldn't have been any older than 9 or 10, and he was physically abused when he came in. Certain patients had single rooms with no day room privileges. Every day she had to wait for a guard to cuff these patients before she could enter and clean their rooms. The boy would talk to her so sweetly and ask her how her day was, telling her things like she was his favorite person there, etc. She said she would go home and cry thinking about him. Then one day while waiting for a guard, he said, "Hi, Mrs. Sue. I think I'm going home today." And when the guard came to cuff him for her to clean, He attacked him with a pencil, stabbed him through the cheek and arm before the guard was able to subdue him. He had coached another employee for paper and pencil so he could draw. Instead, he sharpened it to a point and waited for the guard. She said watching him go from sweet child to an attempted murderer in a split second scared her more than the attack did, and she had a hard time trusting anyone after that incident. I'm currently employed as a mental health peer worker. There's two that come to mind when I think about what's been the scariest I've come across. One was someone with traumatic brain injury, TBI. The instant shift into a violent urge rage was incredibly scary to witness, and managing it can be extremely challenging. Therapy doesn't work, and neither does medication. The other is anyone with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, or ASPD, antisocial personality disorder. I feel like people with ASPD can do well with therapy if they want it. They can be shown that working with other people and working in a mutually beneficial way makes their own lives better. They have to do a lot of work though, and usually it's when they pick up the ASPD traits early on in life. But NPD always scares me. That could be my own personal experiences impacting it, but I'm not aware of any therapeutic benefit to treating them. I could be wrong. Their egos are made up of a fake outer shell, and any attempt to work on or point out that wound deep inside crumbles this shell. They protect it with every tactic they have, sometimes violently. Actually, if they are in treatment, they can make their manipulation and abuse worse because they learn therapy talk and use treatment as new tactics for control. Very scary stuff. Sociopaths. Smart, antisocial ones. Nothing, and I mean nothing, scares me more than those things. To be clear, it's not because of what they do. Folks on drugs or dealing with paranoid schizophrenia can also be unpredictable and incredibly harmful. Furthermore, a lot of them are trying to stay out of jail or trouble and not act like horror movies. It's not that they look like us, but don't act like humans. For most of us, our objectives revolve around other people. We want friends, family, affection, respect, love, etc., and seek to also share our lives and provide for others. Our goals, life itself, revolve around others, our pack, so to speak. For sociopaths, life is a game. A literal game that no one else knows the rules for. Even if you are somehow beating them, they will just change the rules and you'll lose. Nothing is off the table for them unless it undermines whatever other objective they have. Killing you absolutely crosses their mind, but it's usually not worth it if it means they have to stop dominating or grinding the will to live out of their wife, poisoning their family for attention, pimping out their children for power over other child molesters, or trying to convince other young adults at the shelter to kill themselves, etc. What they do find worth doing, they will do. And you never know what that might be. I can promise you, though, that if you see them or treat them as humans, they will get one over on you. Because in reality, they are a facsimile of a human, with all the biological components, but missing the part that makes us want to be a member of the pack. Sitting with them, interviewing them, trying to treat them, you get a strange feeling in your gut, like you absolutely need to flee, but your brain is telling you that there is no data to support that impulse. You kind of struggle to make sense of it, and sometimes I experience it feeling shy. I'm not shy though, yo. That's my brain tripping over the monster that's in the room with me.